Today we will look at writing a literature review. Again, these slides, which you are going to see, were drawn from multiple sources that I'm no longer able to remember fully, but nevertheless, they are helpful, and the copyright belongs to whoever they are due. We're just using it because they are helpful in constructing the literature review. So the literature review, more than just a chapter in the old format of writing a thesis, is also a process as well as an outcome, which means that the literature review, just as we have said in previous recordings, precedes any protocol in doing research. But also, at the same time, the literature review is an outcome. It can sometimes appear in the draft of a thesis proposal as part of the introduction, which means that it falls in that area of the theoretical or conceptual framework, and or as a separate chapter of the study. The outcome basically plays a very important role, as these determines our understanding of how we should present the different literatures that we have in fact considered. In the old tradition, the RRL is presented in terms of types of documents, books, journals, policies, and the like. However, in the more contemporary rendition of the literature review, this is already done per concept, per dimension. And it is in these concepts and dimensions which are thematically organized according to the statement of the problem. And that means the statement of the problem dictates how the RRL will look like, and therefore also provides the lens by which we will approach the statement of the problem. These alignment will play a very important role in understanding how we will approach the paper or the thesis or dissertation eventually afterwards. But the literature review is also a process. As a process, it is not a mere reporting of books in an annotated bibliographical form. But rather a critical engagement, which means one that involves thinking, one that involves reading, and one that involves synthesizing what we have read with the relevant concepts on the topic. And I emphasize concept from the Latin term conceptus. And also, why? For example, in many research books, you read the word conceptualization or even operationalization. It is in the literature review, in the consumption of different literatures, journals, and books for that matter, that we are able to form the concept that we are utilizing in the study. Last, it's also worth emphasizing that concepts such as leadership styles, emotional intelligence, firefighting capability, for example, are never used univocally in any research. The meaning, the nuancing will always vary depending on who or what sources we bank on, or whoever or whatever sources we rely on. Yes, there are landmark scholars, texts, even cases for those who are working in law. But nevertheless, despite so, it is worth saying that the researcher needs to decide on whose concepts or on whose ideas we are standing on. In a way, for those who find it difficult to write a thesis, the consolation there is that there is no you are not going to draw on this one from nothing, as if you can think of you can think of your research from nothing. There is no such thing, you know. We, whether you like it or not, in the academic world, we are dependent on the work of others, and as such, it's very important to see that crucial relationship or that dependency on others. And thus, when you look at it, there is a relationship, very strong relationship between the outcome and the process. The outcome is a consequence of the process, but also the process shapes the outcome, and vice versa in a cyclical way. Now, talking of critical thinking, of course, there are different perspectives of understanding critical thinking. In the undergraduate level, it's important to look at your literature as backing your points up with appropriate or even authoritative sources. And the important term to consider there is the word backing your points up. It's very interesting that other people will not choose to back their ideas or points with appropriate authoritative sources, but instead hide behind authoritative sources. No? In academic writing, more than ever, it's not because somebody said so that it becomes citable or quotable. Instead, it's very important to understand how the particular idea supports your idea. It's actually the other way around. Instead of allowing an author to say what you want to say, what we want to push forward in research is actually to allow what other people said to strengthen, support, or even counter, for that matter, what you are saying. That's why in the master's level, see, it's also a matter of showing, manifesting your understanding of how knowledge is created. And there you'd see the importance of corroborating claims. Of course, in the PhD level, you need to be able to demonstrate new or original knowledge, but also on the professional or academic level, you need to look at how your peers review the work, how you build a coherent body of work, and the like. Why is it important to write critically when we are actually working on the RRL? Precisely because, as you would see in this one, the cognitive domain that was revised by Anderson and Krathwohl, you'd see that the higher order thinking skills of creating, evaluating, and analyzing are actually what we are aiming at, especially for those who intend to use research as a mode of pushing forward knowledge as we know it. Of course, applying and understanding is still important, but we're not simply here to recall or to remember. At the end of the day, the goal is to be able to create. Remembering, recalling, listing, repeating is a very basic knowledge. Explaining, classifying is the second one. Demonstrating, using, illustrating is the third. But the more important one is when we're able to compare, to contrast, to examine, or even when we are able to evaluate, appraise, argue, or even judge. But nothing compares to constructing, designing, creating, developing, writing, and even formulating, which is actually at the peak of the Hutz pyramid, according to Anderson, or as revised by Anderson. So, to read critically then plays a very important role in the research process. It's not because what you are reading said so that it becomes true. We need to be careful about that. We need to look at, when we read the text, what is the agenda or what is the aim of the paper, of the book? Is the aim being pushed forward here being achieved? If so, how? Are there problems with the methodology? Was it a strong or weak research model? How will the research help in your own research? That's a very important thing there. The RRL is not a matter of having something to cite, but instead citing the relevant documents needed or relevant to your paper. And therefore also to ask the question, what can we take from it? What needs to be avoided? Perhaps the report, the research, the journal, the book reported mishaps, errors, then you can learn from them. And then also a mode of distinguishing what they have done from what you are doing. And therefore to ask the question, what am I doing differently? It's interesting also to understand critical thinking from a young child's perspective. And to simply have that curiosity of why. Why is the author saying this? Why? Why? A 3-year-old child would always ask why, or how does that work? Or what's that made of? Or what's that for? Or what does that mean? Or they also contrast by saying, but X says, or how do you know that is the case? Or so what? Or says who? Or what happens if? These are very good guide questions to actually allow us to reflect on a particular text that we are reading, no? So that we don't simply become passive readers, but really active readers. So what critical thinking can mean for the literature review is to understand research on its own terms, to have that objectivity, thereby questioning, clarifying claims or statements. So it's not enough to simply read that this is the case. We need to also clarify what is the author's basis for saying that these are the case. So we don't simply accept it simply because it's published. We need to be critical about it because it is published. We also need to look at how this paper is related to other arguments in the field. Just like in any paper that we write or in any essay that we write, the thesis will play a very important role. In the thesis statement, what the thesis statement is constitutes the key argument for every essay, which is my way of saying every essay must have a thesis statement, which also means we need to be able to clarify what the thesis statement is of a particular claim, of a particular paper, and see throughout whether the author was in fact successful in arriving at that argument, proving that argument. And lastly, critiquing research in relation to what you do. It's not enough, as I said, to simply read the research. We need to always understand the research in relation to what we are trying to do. So that critical thinking involves even my own reading about how this research is actually affecting my research, or what in this research can be useful in my research. So it's not simply a matter of consumption. It's also a matter of deciding whether this research that I am reading right now is significant to what I'm working on. That too plays a very important role. So in starting to think about your own literature review, you need to ask who are the key players in the field. So for example, you wanted to work on emotional intelligence, you cannot not cite the important texts on emotional intelligence. Your failure to cite the important literature on the topic that you are working on betrays, if anything, you. So that if you wanted to do philosophy, metaphysics for that matter, you need to be able to cite at least the important thinkers in the field. And that could be anything from academics to medics to governing bodies, schools of thought, and etc. That means know the important sources. Again, I will repeat, you cannot not cite the important thinkers or key players in the field. So if you are working on laws, for example, you cannot cite the landmark cases. You need to cite them. That's what I'm saying. You need to cite the important people in the field. Second, you need also to be able to clarify the main ideas or debates in the field. You need to be able to see nuances in perspective. What is the difference between these key player from another key player in their understanding of this concept? Where do I stand in relation to these concepts? That too will play a very important role. You cannot simply say this is the case because a particular stance is always supported by a particular debate. So you need to be able to read also, articulate even, nuance even, how your idea is different from another idea. So that simply Googling about the human person doesn't mean that everything that you are able to Google about the human person are in fact the same. There are traditions in the academic world. There are perspectives. There are key personas. And you need to be able to nuance those. You need to be able to see the distinction, for example, between Anaxagoras and Anaximander in philosophy, or Plato and Aristotle. You need to be able to see the difference, the traditions that comes from Locke and those that comes from Spinoza, and to be properly, carefully nuance these ideas such that you are able to know, clarify for yourself which tradition you are really banking on. You need also to identify how have these ideas changed over time, and therefore the developments of these main debates. What are some of the problems with these ideas and debates? You need to also know their weaknesses, as all perspectives do have weaknesses. You also need to consider the methodology, how they were able to arrive at their claims. This is not simply a matter of receiving, accepting the reports. This is also a matter of evaluating the methodologies that they've implemented in order to arrive at their claims. For example, were the methodologies problematic? A very good case, for example, is the syphilis study of Tuskegee, which carried certain ethical repercussions in terms of data gathering or methodology. So that, for example, is interesting. Although the findings can be significant, because the method wasn't ethical, the findings which are of significant nature loses its significance. Or what are you going to do differently? That too will have to be considered. Let's look at them one by one. First stage then in the literature review, when you start writing your literature review, is to identify the key people in the field and also to collate all the relevant sources about your topic. This is, of course, a matter of identifying what policies are important for you, what are the things that you need to consider, why are these important for me, and things like that. You need to ask yourself what research or what theory, what concept is there on my topic? Who are the different theorists? What are the key sources, books, articles on my topic that I have to take into consideration? Who are the main theorists and researchers in this area? And why am I actually pursuing them? Or how was the topic, problem being investigated over time? Or their changes and developments? So it's worth reminding everyone, of course, at this point, that you don't need to read everything about the topic. To be honest, you just can't. You don't need to read every text. You don't need to read every word. You don't need to read every author who wrote about the topic. At a certain point, you need to be prudent in the selection. You can scan some, you can print some, but at the end of the day, you can't work on everything. It's just almost impossible to do that. Whether you like it or not, it's we need to be able to also see how certain things fit with each other, no? Are related to each other, if you will. So if you're worried right now about searching for all the texts or all the authors, there's no such thing. In fact, while we do discourage citing the Wikipedia, and I'll say that again, never cite the Wikipedia, because that will discredit your reputation as a researcher. You can, however, look into the Wikipedia for leads. And once you already have the lead, you can start pursuing it by looking for the works of these leads. That will help you a lot. Once you have the relevant sources, you can now begin to think about what the key ideas, debates, methodologies are in the field. You can also think about how these ideas have changed over time. So debates are very important, especially in academic writing, as the entire thesis rests or banks on a singular argument that you are trying to prove. Yes, the general statement of the problem for thesis papers is the thesis statement. And it is that thesis statement that we divide into specific questions in the hope that when the specific questions are answered, so is the thesis statement. So the entire paper then rests on a particular argument, a particular main side of a debate or a main idea. So it's very important to be able to find what theoretical framework resonates with that. It's so interesting to read a paper that simply jumbled philosophical traditions or theological traditions or linguistic traditions, as if the linguistic traditions, philosophical, theological, sociological, or even military science traditions are just interchangeable. No. This doesn't happen that way. So you need to ask yourself very, very seriously, how has the topic or problem been defined? And that's the reason why you need to define the problem in the RRL. That's why I said follow the outline of the statement of the problem. Are there any trends and patterns that are there across the literature? What methodological assumptions and approaches have been used? Or what are the agreements or disagreements between theorists about the topic you are working on? These are all very important claims to pay attention to or to watch, because they will allow us to recognize also the movements of the study. And therefore, also, of the direction we are trying to take. So, to organize your material, you need to be able to identify a debate. You need to be able to see how scholar X understands your concept differently from scholar Y. And to be able to do that, you need to be able to know whether they disagree with each other, whether they agree with with each other and the school of thought, whether they build on the conclusions of each other, or whether they confirm the findings of or has reservations about each other. So when you organize your ideas, you need to be able to say that the thought of scholar X disagrees with scholar Y, or that the idea of scholar Y agrees with scholar X, or that scholar Y builds on the conclusions of scholar X and pushes it forward, or that this literature confirms the findings of this study, or that scholar Y has reservations about scholar X, or scholar X have reservations about the claims of scholar Y. That's how you build your material. So only then, so when identifying the key ideas, these slides would further say, even when you identify the themes or even the methodologies that are employed in the field, it is very important and it is worth emphasizing over and over again that we should think critically about the literature. We need to think actively about the literature. This will allow us to recognize what is being said about the field and what is not being said about the field. There you see the gap in the literature. So it's very important to know where your biases are and how you stand in relation to these biases. You need to ask yourself what are the strengths or the weaknesses of these debates, what evidence is lacking, or what is inconclusive, or what is limited in their claims, or what will we add to the topic, and what will we do differently from what has been pushed forward. So, planning is very important here, no? Planning is about organizing the structure of your literature review. And I've told you a number of times that how you will organize the information will do a lot about how you will proceed in the study. And there are many ways to plan it: chronologically, thematically, by trends, by their methodologies, approaches, and techniques, by major debates or controversies, or probably a combination of all of those. But my suggestion is that when you outline your RRL, always outline it following the statement of the problem, which is my way of saying thematically. And then, after you have outlined the sections thematically, following the statement of the problem, you can do it chronologically, globally, from the global literature to the local literature, or better yet, in accordance with the conceptualization of the paper. You can, of course, learn from jotting down ideas that are relevant to you, moving around them, creating links, putting texts, swapping diagram and outline, like a pendulum, and transferring to Word document. You'd see that the mind map will play a very important role eventually in the end. Some researchers, for example, will demand that you turn this mind mapping into the conceptual or the theoretical framework. The conceptual and theoretical framework, of course, we will have another recording for that, basically lays down, puts on paper the different perspectives, the different concepts, and how together they constitute the basis or framework, if you will, by which you will approach your study. So it provides you with a lens such that if you're looking for weaknesses, you need to have surveyed what weaknesses the literature have said about your topic. It need not be direct, but related at least. And eventually, you'd see how the conceptual framework is in fact a creative rendition of the paper. Once we have laid down at least the important sections of the literature, then we can start writing it. We can begin with an overview. It's better. In the Jesuit tradition, we were always said that before you say something, there are three things that you need to always consider. One, say what you're gonna say. Two, say it. And three, say that you've said what you promised to say. Three perspectives. Say what you're gonna say it, say that you've said it. So start with an overview. Never, even if you put a framework, always begins with, even if you put a heading, always begins with a short introduction. And then decide on the organizing principles. And as I've said a while ago, you can do it thematically. And then after the thematic movement, you can look at the chronology. You can look at global to local literatures. You can look at trends, chronology, controversies. Usually, as it's also said in this slide, it's a combination of these points. It's also important to use headings. And the headings are determined by the statement of the problem, as I have said and suggested to have said. Of course, you can put subheadings, but please pay attention on the rules of outlining. Yes, I've said it, on the rules of outlining. It's very important that the researcher is able to outline his literature, whether it's going to fall in the conceptual or the theoretical framework, or it's going to fall into another chapter. We need to be able to outline it and follow proper headings, outlining headings, for the reader to be guided properly, whether this is a main heading or a subheading or a sub-subheading. Go back to your outlining skills. Also, when we write this paper, we need to be able to provide summative signposts, which means it's not enough to simply report what you have read, to simply put on paper what has been said. The summative signpost basically synthesizes the work and explains in another way where the literature is going, is going. That's why some research formats will even have a gaps and synthesis section after the literature is presented. And that is in order for the researcher to summarize the highlight gap or the identified gap in the research. Because the literature review is going to be a synthesis of multiple sources, it's very important to be clear. I always say to my students, if I don't understand your answer, you will also not understand your grade. Which is my way of telling them that it is their task to be clear in what they want to say. clarity is at the heart of everything. So tips, it needs to have a clear introduction. You need to have a clear overview of the topic. You need to clarify the aim of the review and the structure of the review. You need to have a clear paragraph structure. And here we go back to the basics of writing. Every paragraph must have a topic sentence, and all the succeeding paragraphs should be supporting sentences of the topic sentence. So the first sentence is the topic sentence, and then supporting ideas, examples can be provided succeedingly. Make sure that it's not only an issue of the paragraph, it's also an issue of the sentence. Is the subject, the doer of the action, clear? Of course, this is again going to be an issue of active and passive voice and the play between the two, which is okay. But at least in academic writing, the doer should be clear. Just as in any writing, never assume the obvious. Even if you think that it is already common knowledge, it is best to consider that it is not common. That way, we are able to clearly lay down, flesh out what we want to say and how we want to say it. Make sure also that key terminologies and even complex and difficult ideas in the statement of the problem are always thoroughly explained. And it's not a matter of you being able to say that this person defined it this way or that way. It is your task as a writer and researcher to flesh it further in a way that your reader will understand it. Be objective and balanced. As a person who's easily swayed by emotions and the like, loses their stand, loses their claim to being reputable. And then use signposts to orient the reader. You always need to take note, is the reader still following your ideas? And therefore, you need to provide signposts where you are already. So you can say the first of two claims argues, and then maybe at a certain point, you can say the second of two claims. Or you can use on the one hand and on the other hand. I've seen paper that only use the one hand, and I've been waiting for the other hand, but the other hand never comes. Or if you say latter and former, you need to be sure that there are, in fact, at least a latter or a former. Using signposts will help your reader understand where you are going and why you are going there. In the literature review, we need to see that this is not simply a combination of many things. No, this is not simply a combination of all the things you want to take into consideration. No. Whether you like it or not, the literature is still part of the thesis, and as such, because it's still part of the thesis, it will play a crucial, you are still the one writing, not them. And therefore, it still needs to be your voice talking, not somebody else's voices. Which means that when you write your paper, it still needs to be written with your voice there. So you have to be there. No? So where appropriate, begin sections and paragraphs with a statement which synthesizes or analyzes the works that will follow rather than just describing it. You need to be able to show that you were able to process these ideas. In short, chew the literature, dissect the literature, absorb the literature. Don't simply report it. You need to be able to show that the literature is always related to what you are doing. Use signposting words to demonstrate how texts are related to each other and also what you think of them. You can use however, yet, moreover, indeed, similarly, etc. But signpost, no? Lead the reader, guide the reader. That's what we're saying. Again, in terms of paragraphs and flows, you've said this already very quickly a while ago. Every paragraph needs to have a topic sentence. And the topic sentence, when they are grouped together, should point to a theme, at least. And the theme should point to the thesis statement. That's really the organization of an essay. And it's important to go back to normal essay writing structures to be able to get a refreshed understanding of that. Take note also that the succeeding sentences in a paragraph must be a discussion of the topic. And the discussion of the topic can be divided into subtopics, sentences, and also by providing justification or even examples to the topic sentence. And then it ends with a closing sentence. By looking at these discussion about paragraphs and writing paragraphs in this slide, you'd see that there are going to be at least 3 sentences already. But again, a paragraph is not just composed of 3 sentences. It's better to understand paragraphs to have more than that. The paragraph should not be more than 15 sentences. 10 sentences is okay as long as they're short, but you decide how long the paragraph should be. Do not write a 10-page paragraph. No? I worked on a philosopher whose name is Jacques Derrida, and he did that at a certain point. He didn't just write a 10-page paragraph. He wrote a 1-sentence, 10-page sentence, which is insane. And then look at the thematic and the grammatical links. Pay attention at the logical progression of one paragraph to the next. Remember, the paragraphs point to the thesis statement or a subtopic in the thesis statement. So the logical progression is important. You need to facilitate a flowing paragraph progression. You also need to demonstrate the links in the language to make sure or to point also how one paragraph is related to the other. And then it's also important to illustrate trends by synthesizing literature. Again, in some patterns, we are able to, in some format, thesis format, there's a specific section for gaps and synthesis. But in the absence of such, it's also important that we synthesize literature by showing that we are able to see where they all agree and not. So avoid list-like structures that simply illustrate trends and patterns such as you have here below. No? So to simply say research into thesis titles have emphasized the use of the colon to distinguish the thematic focus from the precise focus of the work. It's actually discouraged to do these. Why? Because it assumes that the work all pointed to the same claim, but in reality, we're not aware of the nuances of such claim, right? It's very important to be specific also along these lines. Sorry. And then use citations in the literature review. And when I say use citations, of course, it will depend again on the institutional format, whether they decide to use a parenthetical referencing or the more traditional paragraph, footnoting, and the like. There are two types of citations that we can consider, the integral and the non-integral. When we say integral citation, the author's name appears in the sentence, following, for example, the author date system. In this case, Lillis, 2001, argues that both authors and students often lack explicit knowledge of the conventions governing the construction of academic texts. That's integral. There is really a very clear reference to Lillis and the work of Lillis. But if you think that mentioning Lillis is not important, but only the idea that you were able to get from the work Lillis, then you can do this one, the non-integral approach to citation. Here, the author's name appear, but this time it's already outside the sentence and sometimes only in the citations. For example, both tutors and students often lack explicit knowledge of the conventions governing the construction of academic texts, Lillis 2001. So you'd see in this case that that the mentioning of the name will play a very important role if the person that you are citing really is worth mentioning. But if not, you simply put them in the footnote or the reference note. When citing, though, it's very important to still consider the writer's voice. Whose voice is at work? Whose voice is dominant? Is it the writer's? Is it the original author's work? We've looked at Bree 1999 and used it in multiple ways, 5 ways in this presentation, to show to you also differences in perspective, and also in the hope that by doing so, you'd recognize which is worth emphasizing and why. For example, the moon is made of cheese. Bree 1999, that's the idea. Bree 1999 argues that the moon is made of cheese. As Bree 1999 points out, the moon is made of cheese. According to Bree, the moon is made of cheese. However, Bree 1999 argues out that the moon is made of cheese. So here, in these 5 examples from this set of slides, you'd realize that the importance of finding the voice will play a very important role. Of course, this will vary depending on what emphasis you want to build on and why you are in fact building on this emphasis. Nevertheless, it can be helpful to identify who is talking and why they are talking. Lastly, and I'm done after this one, the literature review is an evolving one in a research. That means it's not something you do now and forget about in the end. You have to understand that any field, for that matter, is constantly evolving and changing. And as such, there is a continuous need to actually reassess, reevaluate, and re-understand our perspectives on the matter. I'll end this presentation here on writing your literature review and the role of critical thinking and the author's voice. If you like this type of content, I hope you'd subscribe and like the YouTube channel Samo't sa Simula. And thank you very much for your attention.